Hello, I'm Mark, and this is In the Round, Building Big Part 3, the building process. Again, we'll be working in the ceramics studio, where I'm going to quickly take you through my process for large-scale building. This will be a broad strokes overview, but in parts 4 and 5, I'll focus more closely on the specific techniques I use for preliminary shaping and for final sculpting and detailing, so be sure to check those out. Also, you can look back on parts 1 and 2 for how to make the clay I'm using and how to roll slabs, which are the primary stock material for this kind of building. The steps of the building process are stock preparation, construction, preliminary shaping, sculpting, finishing and detailing. It's important to note that these are not discrete steps, but rather staggered, overlapping stages. You won't construct the entire sculpture, then shape it, then sculpt it. Rather, you will construct and roughly shape the base, only adding the second section when the first is sufficiently dry to support it. You will then alternate between sculpting the base section and shaping the second section, stiffening both yet more in preparation for adding the third section, and so on, up the sculpture. It's not uncommon for the lower third of a sculpture to be nearly complete before the top third has even begun. As you might imagine, working in this way requires a pretty clear idea of what you're working towards before you begin. I highly recommend making a few small-scale preparatory models. You could also plan the sculpture in a digital program and 3D print a model for reference. I'm here making a large-scale version of this little slip-cast porcelain figure, called Darling, that was originally designed in ZBrush. As part of this planning process, you'll want to map out your basic structures, breaking the sculpture down into simple forms, each as close to an upright cylinder as you can make it. Decide if any parts of the sculpture will benefit from being constructed separately, then attached later. A projecting arm, for instance, or if the sculpture should be built in sections. Some people like to split standing figures at the waist, building the legs upside down, then attaching them when everything is more or less sculpted. Also, consider whether you need any interior support structures. For Darling, I used a lot of support, because the head is both very large and overhangs the rather small chest pretty dramatically. For Honey, who's basically just one big cylinder, I used almost no supports at all. The process. Cut your stock slabs to size. Let the slabs dry, or force dry them, until you can safely roll them into cylinders and stand them up. You want them to be stiff enough to support their own weight without slumping, but not so dry that they crack when you bend them. You can make this process easier by rolling them around a form, such as a rolling pin or one of those heavy-duty concrete form tubes. Join the cylinders at their seams. Use a rib and counterpressure to thoroughly compress the walls, both inside and out. Start to pre-shape them, working towards simplified versions of the shapes you're trying to create. Stiffen the component parts further until they are stable enough to safely join. To facilitate this process, I'm using a heat gun and wheel setup. This is a really effective method, but do not leave it unattended. You might come back to bone-dry parts, or worse, to a fallen heat gun and a fire. Note also that although a heat gun can greatly speed up many ceramic processes, it can be a somewhat deceptive tool. This is because it will rapidly dry the outer layer of clay, creating a thin shell of brittle material over the still soft interior. It's important to allow time for this interior moisture to equalize through the wall before you can trust the wall's structural integrity. This is far less of a problem in using paper clay because it channels moisture so readily, but you should still be cautious. If you need more strength in a particular spot for structural reasons, you can also try spot drying by putting the heat gun directly against the clay in one or more strategic places. The dry spots will add a degree of temporary stiffness while you work, but will soon draw moisture from the surrounding wall and rehydrate, regaining most of their plasticity. This method only works with paper clay. Do not put a heat gun directly against regular clay. Assemble the parts. If the edges you're joining are relatively soft, you can just work them together. If they're more stiff, use slip and/or soft clay as seems necessary. The important thing is that you work the seams enough to fully unify them, creating one continuous wall. I would recommend using a serrated rib to crosshatch over the joint on both the inside and the outside. The paper in the clay will channel moisture through the seam, greatly facilitating this joining process. Shape the base layer, stiffening it up as you work until it's safe to build on. Then start working your way up the sculpture, constructing, shaping, sculpting, constructing, shaping, sculpting, and so on. The primary shaping methods I use are darting, gusseting, splitting and patching, stretching, folding, compressing, and paddling. The primary sculpting and finishing methods I use are skim coating, carving, surface compression, abrasion, brushing, and sponging. Again, we'll take a closer look at all of these methods in building big parts 4 and 5. It's crucial to monitor the moisture level of your clay. Paper clay can dry out very quickly, but fortunately it can also be easily rehydrated. Make sure to have a spray bottle on hand while you work to wet down the sculpture if parts of it seem to be getting too dry. See my video Wrapping Up for more on moisture control. When you first start building this way, I'd recommend going with about 8-inch sections, then maybe pushing to 10 or 12 inches if you can. Depending on the complexity and overhang of the curves I'm working towards, I use between 4 and 20-inch slabs. This building method is straightforward, but can be somewhat tricky to put into practice. Problems are almost invariably due to timing and therefore deeply grounded in material experience. With practice, however, you will find that building big isn't as hard or time-consuming as you might imagine.